I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today I'm reading Chapter 13 of my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. It's called Finance is an Extractive Industry, and it's a chapter in Section 4, Attack of the Petrodactyls. After this, there's one more chapter that goes into the deep economics of how we got into this position. This is really important because you can't imagine how things could be differently and figure out a way to get out of it if you don't understand what's happening. So in order to figure out a solution or even recognize it, you first have to really understand the problem. Otherwise, you think that there are simple solutions that could work. And the solution, I think, is simple, but it is system change. There's no quick fix that is going to change this. In this chapter, in particular, I talk about how the mortgage rate is key to everything. Inflation is caused by the manipulation of the interest rate. Paradoxically, a stable high interest rate keeps the cost of housing low. So this creates a scenario where we have to gamble with our savings and give them right back to the usurpers in order for us to keep pace with inflation. So stick with this one, and we will be getting to the fun stuff of looking at system change and then the solution. I start with a quote from Philip Smith and Manfred Max Neef from Economics Unmasked. At the core, there is a simple relationship between the structure of a society and its measure of justice. Stated succinctly, it is the distribution of economic and financial power that determines how just a society is. The more concentrated this power, the less just a society. An unregulated, so-called free market leads irrevocably to the concentration of economic power. It is the economic structure of today's global world that generates the greatest obstacle to molding a more just world society. Political power is subservient to economic power simply because economic and financial power give political power to those who have it. And inversely, those without economic power are bereft of the means to wield political power. Of course, economics aside, unjust political systems cause great suffering, but the political regime of a land is visible and can, in principle, be fought against. Not so the economic system, the workings of which are largely invisible. And we're going to look at changing that. Finance is an extractive industry. In Economics Unmasked, Philip Smith and Manfred Max Neef look at the concentration of economic power as the litmus test for injustice in a society. They write, "The market transfers more wealth and power to those who already have much of both, while depriving those without either of the possibility of defending themselves against exploitation and its concomitant injustice." Colonization was indeed initially promoted by political and military means, but it was fundamentally an economic arrangement in which the poorer countries delivered cheap labor, raw materials, and agricultural products, while serving as a market for finished products. Today, however, practically no military might is needed, but only largely invisible economic power to continue unabated this centuries-old process of plunder. This explains why globalization is so popular domestically and internationally among those individuals and nations with the most wealth and power. Smith and Max Neef use the terms wealth and power rather than money. Common Dreams journalist Paul Buchheit illustrates the difference. According to the authors of the Global Wealth Report, the world's wealth has doubled in 10 years, from $113 trillion to $223 trillion, and that was in 2012, and is expected to reach $330 trillion by 2017. The UN definition of wealth includes 1. Natural capital, land, forests, fossil fuels, and minerals. 2, physical capital, buildings and infrastructure, and 3, human capital, the population's education and skills. They write, we need to add a 4th category, the magical creation of wealth by the financial industry. As Buchheit makes clear, the financial industry isn't actually creating wealth at all by the UN's definition. The amount of natural capital is not increasing. On the contrary, forests, fossil fuels, and minerals are being depleted at a rapid pace. And yes, I know about fossil fuels. Don't lecture me. In Eduardo Galeano's The Open Veins of Latin America, he sees natural capital as blood drained from the living continent to feed the voracious appetite for power elsewhere. He writes, Latin America is the region of open veins. Everything from the discovery until our times has always been transmuted into European, or later United States, capital, and as such has accumulated in distant centers of power. Everything, the soil, its fruits, and its mineral-rich depths, the people and their capacity to work and to consume natural resources and human resources. If natural capital is not increasing with the purported doubling of wealth, what about physical capital? Infrastructure, even in developed countries, is falling apart faster than it's being repaired. Tools, machinery, and factories have moved where labor is cheapest, and human capital has certainly not experienced a doubling in education and skills over the course of each decade, based on the investment that's been made in it. The only thing that's increased is Buchheit's 4th category, the magical creation of wealth by the financial industry, which isn't wealth by the UN's definition, only money. The magical creation of money. Is there a relationship between the issuing of money and the economic power that usurps the natural, physical, and human capital of whole countries? Who has been given the magical ability to create money? And how does that relate to ownership of the real wealth? In the first sections, we saw that money is not a unit of trade because goods and resources flow in one direction, from poorer or undeveloped nations to the so-called rich and developed. Likewise, it's not a measure of stored labor value, because the countries who export the products of their labor are still in debt, not amassing a surplus for a rainy or dry decade. So what is money really? As stated before, money is a means of organizing labor in the interest of whoever issues it. Money is a credit that, in order for it to have any value, must be backed by actual wealth, as the UN describes it, natural, physical, or human capital, not mere financial instruments. Money gives the issuer of the credit de facto ownership of said capital. Money under capitalism is an economic system for concentrating ownership of capital. Communism and socialism, however, as they've been actualized, aren't the opposite of capitalism because they also don't distribute the wealth. Like capitalism, they concentrate ownership within a centralized government, but use political power rather than economic. They distribute the results of production, not the means or a responsibility, sometimes according to political favors along party lines. The opposite of both capitalism and communism is sovereignty. Within a federal system, the money issued by the colony of Pennsylvania in Benjamin Franklin's time was backed by the natural capital of land. The mortgages repaid the credit by providing goods and services to the community. The government issued additional money to pay for government services, such as subsidized postal service, roads, schools, and libraries. They collected the money back in mortgages and taxes, giving them the perpetual ability to organize labor for the community's benefit. It was a complete circle, with no need for inflation. But today, neither the state nor the federal, so-called centralized government has the power to issue money. Dollars are issued by the Federal Reserve, a federation of bank owners. Coins alone can be government generated, and then only at the national level. The wealthy individuals who own the banks control the natural, physical, and human capital of the United States and organize labor in their interests. Truthish lies and legal fictions. The vast majority of the credit traded as money, 97% of dollars, is issued by commercial banks as mortgages. When a person applies for a mortgage, their future labor is the wealth they pledge for the loan. The bank can issue 10 times their capital in loans, but the capital they claim is mere bank credit that gives the bank owners control over 10 times the amount in real estate without ever touching their own investment. The bank credit issued as the mortgage doesn't come from the bank owner's own money, which remains safe as the capital and not at risk. Neither does it come from depositor accounts, as was portrayed in It's a Wonderful Life. If it did, there would be higher interest paid on long-term deposits and pension accounts in order to attract stable funds. In the early days of the mortgage, foreclosures were successfully challenged in court because it could be shown that the bank had contributed nothing to the contract in order to make it valid. Later judges agreed with the argument in principle, but reversed the verdict because they said it would call the whole basis of the economy into question. As said before, banks create money through double-entry bookkeeping, entering a loan as a credit and a debit simultaneously on both sides of a bank's ledger so that their books balance. The credit is an IOU the mortgagees promise to pay with their future labor against a debit deposited into the seller's bank. To balance their books, the lending bank then borrows from the recipient bank at the interbank lending rate, set by the Fed funds rate, which has been hovering between 0 and 0.25% since 2001. Through this legal fiction of a 30-year mortgage, the banks control a stored value of 60 years' labor, split between two people. In George Carlin's words, they own you. And in the Substack version, I'll attach a brilliant article by Richard Warner that explains this, and thank you to Loa for recommending that. Barometric pressure and the money bubble. Let's take a closer look at what it means that the mortgage creates only the principal and not the interest. Where does the rest of the money come from? By lowering the interest rate, the banks churn out enough credit in new mortgages and refinancing to keep the game going. So, using one of the many amortization tables available on the web, I've posted a table that shows what happens when the interest rate goes down for a household that can afford exactly $1,000 a month in payments. So, with the first monthly payment, if it's at 10%, it ends up having a principal of $115,000. That's what they can afford to finance. And then I go down point by point until it gets to 1%. And at that point, with the same $1,000 payment, the principal can be $310,000. So it has almost tripled during that time, and it moves up exponentially. So from 10% to 9% creates $10,000, but from 2% to 1% creates $40,000. As it drops from 10% to 1%, the hypothetical value is also the very real debt of the owner that has tripled. Although their monthly payment is the same, they're at 3 times the risk of foreclosure and would require 3 times as much to pay off their mortgage early. And of course, variable rates would change all of this immediately. As new bank credits enter the economy, dispersed to the seller of the house or to the borrower for a refinance or equity loan, the recipients use it to pay other people, putting it into circulation. If an extra $12,000 is distributed among 10 people over a year, it would raise the monthly mortgage for which each can qualify to $1,100, enabling them to borrow an additional $12,000, continuing to spur the debt spiral up. Letting off steam. However, rather than circulating, within one or two exchanges, the money is extracted from the economy as interest payments. Banks retain the interest payments as profits and disperse them to shareholders and executives as bonuses. They become foreign investments and hedge funds rather than becoming income for ordinary people. With only the principal created by the banks as money and the interest payments removed from the economy, there's not enough money left in circulation to pay off the mortgages. A debt-generated money system issued by private banks must keep expanding the money supply in order to issue their own payments. Inflation, which is really the dilution of money in relationship to the real assets, is inevitable in its design. Inflation is presented as prices growing of their own volition, but it's really an increase in the amount of money in proportion to the goods and services that back the money. Your house is not worth more. Your money is worth less. Every time that the banks issue more debt money, it's like adding hot water to an increasingly weak tea. They pour debt into the economy and out pours ownership of the houses. They pour in more hot water and out pours control of jobs and livelihoods. They pour in the hottest water of all and out tumble young people up to their necks in student debt with no way to get a fingerhold on the steep sides of the cup. A federation of bankers. The Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort. In setting the Fed funds rate, the banks function more or less democratically, sharing a common purpose. A bank's commercial lending rate is typically a 3-point spread over the interbank borrowing rate. It's favorable for them that the lending rate fluctuates so that borrowers will refinance when it goes lower and the banks can profit from the difference between fixed and adjustable rate mortgages. The base rate of the history of the Bank of North Dakota shows that interest was 14% in 1980 and went up to a high of 19% in the middle of 1981. For the months in between, it would careen wildly, up to 18%, down to 10%, and back again. But since 1981, it's wobbled steadily downward until, in 2001, it had reached a low of 3.25%, where it had stayed ever since, up until now. With the Fed funds rate less than 0.25%, the variable lending rate was at rock bottom. This put a ceiling on how much new money could be put in circulation by dropping the interest rate. Starting in 1992 through 2002, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan expanded the money supply directly by over 12% a year, doubling it in less than a decade. After 9/11, it reached 15% a year. When Ben Bernanke took over during a period of 18 months up to 2010, he began his own massive expansion from $850 billion to $2.1 trillion. And these are the central bank dollars that create the monetary capital that banks can expand with mortgages at 1-to-10 ratio. However, new mortgage borrowers have been harder to come by once the interbank interest rate hit zero and couldn't be set lower. To incentivize new buyers, the Federal Housing Association started insuring mortgages with as little as a 3.5% down payment. Banks could then issue chancier mortgages at no risk to themselves because they were protected if the home foreclosed lower than its remaining debt. A home buyer with only $10,000 down could qualify for a $350,000 home, rather than the $50,000 home they could have bought during the old days of 20% down payments. And let me clarify, that would have been the same house because this is all competitive. By 2012, FHA insurance was bankrupt, partially due to sellers who had additionally financed the closing costs in order to lure in marginal buyers. In 2008, the federal government extended first-time homebuyer tax credits of 10% of the purchase price up to $8,000. Once again, this market manipulation funded the banks rather than homebuyers by preventing the market from adjusting to the available pool of money. In fact, the tax deductibility of mortgage interest itself was a gift to the banks. In a free market, home prices would fall to the level that home buyers could afford after they paid their taxes to the government. But once prices have been driven up, a tax reform eliminating the mortgage interest deduction would force homeowners out of houses on which they can't make payments without that deduction. Bubble magic. Home ownership is promoted as an investment rather than a purchase because the price inflates over time. Homeowners don't question why a house that's several decades older should cost more, even though other possessions lose value with age and use. Is a house worth more after 30 years? Unless renovations have been done, the house has wear and tear, old plumbing, a deteriorated roof, outdated electricity, and peeling paint. The mortgage has been calculated at the maximum, with little left for maintenance. Clearly, it is not the house that has gained in value. The money itself has lost value. What happened during those decades that the interest rate was dropping and the money supply was expanding? From 1992 to 2000 was a stock market boom, particularly in high tech. With interest on deposits negligible, savings were withdrawn and banks admonished homeowners to put their equity to work by refinancing and investing in the stock market. In a self-fulfilling prophecy, the influx of speculative money pushed real estate prices up, making it less accessible for those wanting its use value as a place to live and put down roots. The stock market and real estate are both hypothetical wealth, valued at the price that someone else paid for other shares of the same stock or for a similar house. When a stock sells, the buyer transfers money to the seller. No money is actually invested in the company. It's more like a stake in a Ponzi scheme, where its worth depends on a buyer who believes they can sell it again for more. Sooner or later, someone is left holding the bag. When a stock is first sold, it mobilizes funds for productive investment or rewards the employees and initial investors. But the secondary market, where well over 95% of purchases take place, merely shuffles ownership. John Maynard Keynes said that as a result of this detachment, I am irresponsible towards what I own, and those who operate what I own are irresponsible towards me. Experience is accumulating that remoteness between ownership and operation is an evil in the relations among men. From equity to inequity. Moreover, stock shares are owned by a fraction of the population. The wealthiest 1% owns over half of all investment assets. The wealthiest 10% owns 81% of all stock, while over half the population owns no stock at all. The stock market rises only because new money is coming in from many people, often in the form of pensions and 401k funds, and being transferred to fewer people at the top. It is a transfer of money to the rich. From February 2000 to October 2002, however, the Nasdaq fell by 78%, resulting in the disappearance of $8 trillion of hypothetical wealth from the buyers, who were not likely to be the 1%. Those who still had money to invest bought books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and got into the rental market. Meanwhile, homeowners who had lost their savings and possibly their jobs borrowed against their home equity or refinanced. In this way, their theoretical home value became actual money circulating in the economy. Both of these factors caused home prices to rise, which increased equity, which enabled more debt, which put more money in circulation. By 2007, the mortgage debt had reached its limits of expansion, with not enough money in circulation to make the payments. The housing bubble burst, followed by foreclosures and deflated sale prices. Layoffs began in earnest, and employers shed 8.4 million jobs in 2 years. The lost generation. If money multiplies without an increase in the actual wealth that backs it, what happens to the families who have to depend on money for their security? Imagine a young couple who managed to buy a house just out of college in 1982. As homeowners who had physical capital, they were elated when their house went up in value the first 2 decades. They could borrow against the gain and take money out, especially when the interest rate went down. Free money. Who can care what caused it? But at the same time as their home value increased, so did their health care costs. With 2 kids to support while working 2 jobs, daycare and private schools took a bite out of their windfall. And just when their kids were ready for college in 2012, they found that tuition had gone up by 550% in the 30 years since they had graduated. Their wages, on the other hand, had stayed stagnant or declined during what economists termed the lost decade. To help put their kids through college, they sell their home, but discover that prices have dropped to the same level as 2002. This reduces their gain to little more than their original down payment had been. Between rising rents and the kids' college dorms, they're now paying more for housing than they had for the mortgage, with nothing to show for it. The money they had borrowed against their equity wasn't used for frivolous purchases, but for upkeep on the house and for services they could have afforded on their salaries if prices had stayed the same as 1982. Meanwhile, the stored labor they saved for retirement has lost value every decade in terms of the labor it will buy when they retire. They'll be lucky if they don't outlive their money. Leave the money, take the assets. To recap, money is not wealth. Wealth, according to the United Nations, is natural, physical, or human capital. Through the creation of credit, issued as debt, aka money, banks lay claim to the physical capital of the community in the form of houses. The credits, the debt-issued money, then become backed by human capital in the form of labor to increase corporate profits or provide services and goods to those who do. The government empowers the banks by accepting those credits, and only these credits, as taxes. After bank credits have been enriched in their trade value through the human capital expended to earn them, they return to the bank in mortgage payments. The police back the credits with violence by enforcing foreclosures over mortgages or property taxes. Once bank credits have passed through the economy, it becomes impossible to separate earned income from speculative gains. Debt monetized through housing and labor is key to a system for taking assets without any value rendered. Once the physical assets have been usurped, labor turns the magical substance created by banks into a trade value, which is then received back in their corporate hand. The interest becomes the profits of the bank owners. The resulting concentration of economic power, which is Max Neef's hallmark of an unjust system, lays claim to natural capital in the form of agribusiness, water rights, mining concessions, and oil extraction, which the military enforces abroad. In this sense, we are all working for the bankers. As Wendell Berry writes in Jayber Crow, I watch and I wonder and I think. I think of the old slavery and of the way the economy has now improved upon it. The new slavery has improved upon the old by giving the new slaves the illusion that they are free. The economy does not take people's freedom by force, which would be against its principles, for it is very humane. It buys their freedom, pays for it, and then persuades its money back again with shoddy goods and the promise of freedom. We can't fix the economy because it's not broken. It's serving the purpose for which it was designed, so well in fact that it's become gutted with a surfeit of overaccumulation. The dollar itself may be the next bubble to burst. Any reforms or redistribution of the money will postpone the crisis and validate the bank credit with our blessing. Perhaps we should take a page from the immortal words of the Godfather when Al Pacino said, "Leave the gun, take the cannoli." In our case, leave the money, take the assets. If we take back our assets so they can no longer be bought with bank credit, the dollars will return to the dust and vapor from whence they came. Then our economies can return to their real purpose, to protect, preserve, and proliferate the natural, physical, and human capital of communities. As always, I end with a lexicon defining words and questions for reflection and discussion, and then the paradigm shifts that have happened in this chapter. In this case, I have 3. First, political power is subservient to economic power. Political power is overt. Economic power is invisible. And number 2, money is not wealth, and wealth is not money. Wealth is ownership of the capital, natural, physical, and human. Money is a means of organizing labor in the interest of whoever creates it. It can be used to extract the wealth from a community or to enhance and protect the wealth for the community. Capitalism is a system for extracting labor by assuming bank ownership of the wealth. Sovereignty is a system to give communities power over their own labor by passing the wealth from one generation to the next with the responsibility to enhance and protect the natural, physical, and human capital and enable individual choice wherever possible. And then the last one is banks create the money, not governments, and extract the interest while the principal cancels itself out, leaving not enough to repay the loan. Therefore, housing inflation is required in order to keep extraction going. And for more, in Bald Explorers and Chimney Sweeps, I argue with someone on why getting rid of taxation does not solve the problem, but mortgages do. And then in Parasites, the First 5,000 Years, I look at how this whole system started. Thank you for watching.